Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Harness. My name is Cody J. Brown, and I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you'd like to rewatch it if you missed any of it, or you'd just like to share it with a friend, the on-demand will be made available after today's webinar concludes. If you have any questions or any comments during today's webinar, I want you to direct those questions to the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. And for just any comments, or if you'd like to tell us where you're tuning in from, use that chat tab that's also located on the right side of your screen. I'd also like to point out that today's slides are already made available for you to download if you use the Handouts tab that can also be found on the right side of your screen. My final note is we will have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so stick around till the end of the webinar to see if you're one of our 4 lucky winners. Let's go ahead and kick off our panel. The topic today is testing in production with feature flags and continuous deployment. And I'm joined today by Connor Ness, Enterprise Solutions Engineer for Harness, and Andy Marshall, Product Sales Manager for Harness. It is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to Andy to get us started. Andy, Connor, thanks so much for being with us today.
Cody, thanks. Really appreciate you having us. We're excited to join you for this hour and talk all about feature flags, how useful they are, how to test in production, and radically how they can kind of change your entire software delivery process. So we're going to set the stage here a little bit, talk about what feature flags are, because we're still running across people all the time that have not yet learned how to leverage them and use them in their system. So we're going to just start kind of with a level playing field. Feature flags was a technique that has been popularized by companies like Facebook and LinkedIn, who wanted to release new features to a small group of users for instant feedback. And they want to use that to influence their decisions for wider rollouts. And so today, feature flags have really become an essential part of every developer's toolkit. They've been in production use for the last 10 years, but they're really starting to become mainstream for the last 5 or 6 years or so. And as a result, we get to tell people about them. And it is a lot of fun to see how this changes people's production. So as we begin our time today, we're going to take a few minutes just to kind of dive into a little bit of why feature flags. We're going to talk about some of the use cases and how it really has changed the landscape of delivery. So starting with this, we're going to talk about how we have traditionally deployed features in software. This may look familiar to you. Traditionally, developers code a feature, they commit that code, they test it, and they sign off on it. And then QA runs through its paces. And then they wait for all the rest of the other developers to catch up with their features to be written and tested and run through its paces. And when all new features, all new pieces of code are ready, we cross our fingers, we flip the switch, and we execute the deployment, and all the features are pushed into production. That should sound familiar. That's the way we've been doing it for a long time. And sometimes this takes quite a bit of time. There's a little bit of waiting involved for everyone to get all their features ready. And it's in a holding tank. And when it's all finally prepared, we flip that switch. If you think for a moment that we call it traditional, if this is antiquated or perhaps the old way of doing it and no longer reality, daily, Connor and I talk to companies that are still doing this exact same motion. Recently, I talked with a Fortune 500 company who reported to me that they release software 4 times a year, and they're working as fast as they can. So this is still a reality and a conversation we have all the time. Here are some problems, though. Here's some outcomes if you do this traditional way of software development. The consequences are sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes people get what they need when you release all the features at one time. Sometimes people don't get what they need. And occasionally, some features don't work at all. And so these are the consequences of doing an all or nothing type of release. There are further consequences too. And that being, feature releases are often determined by developers instead of the business. So what we mean by that is if a developer codes some feature and it's ready. So they just release it and they send it straight out into the wild, and they don't wait on the business. And sometimes this causes friction. And we see that quite a bit, friction between engineering and operational teams who might want to target a specific release date to coincide with maybe a business objective. So that's a consequence of doing delivery in a traditional fashion. Occasionally too, there's slower development of new features because, back to my example of that Fortune 500 company, they only release every couple months. And so new features rolling out are infrequent and slow to get to market. Another consequence of this is that you can't test multiple solutions or implementations because it's an all or nothing approach. When you release it all together at once, all features go out. That is the only solution at that point. Another consequence is there's no way to, or it's pretty cumbersome to release individual features to production because you have to release it all in one big deployment. And finally, another huge consequence is that if you have to roll back something, you've got to roll back the good features along with the bad features. So what I mean by that is if something goes wrong, you roll back to the last known best version of your software or your application. And that means all the good features that we're working get rolled back as well. So it's not a good solution, but it's the way we've been doing things. But today we're going to talk about a better way. And that's really through feature flags, the mighty feature flag. So what we're seeing now in modern delivery with feature flags is that every snippet of the code, every feature that you're writing, we encourage people to wrap a feature flag around it. And conditionally, you're going to...
All right, I'll pick up where Andy was just leaving off. So let's talk about, I think what he was starting to get at is the traditional way that we're developing is this all-in-one deployment. And if we need to roll back, it's an all-in-one pullback. Oh, Andy, you're back.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Why don't you go ahead and take it over?
Excellent. So there's some great use cases that come along with feature flags. So now that we've talked about how they worked a little bit, let's talk about some of the use cases. And the first one is that
Andy,
feature flags really start to increase velocity. So as developers create new features, they can park it behind these flags and ship it immediately into production and then get right back to working on the new code. And this creates a lot of speed if you're shipping consistently. If it's broken, the feature, or if it's incomplete, it's not a big deal because you can deploy it behind a flag in an off state. And so it's completely safe. It isn't impacting your end users. It's simpler, it's faster, and allows your engineers to speed up significantly and push, all new features to production. And when the time is right,
you make sure you're sharing your screen, please.
All right, here we are. So the first use case is really it increases a lot of velocity and allows you to move faster because you're constantly pushing new features to production. The second use case that we see a lot with feature flags is this ability then to control those releases. And this has to do with the ability to be able to target users or cohorts or subsets of your user base. And when you're able to target and control those releases, you get this real world feedback in real time. So you can make changes, experiment, you can test your new features to see how a feature is being received before it's ready for prime time. The third major use case that we see is that of an operational control. And this really has to do with kill switches that are built into feature flagging. So if something goes wrong with a new feature that you've pushed out to production, you can quickly turn off that feature. And within even a half second, every connected device, every browser, every mobile user receives the same command, and the offending feature is immediately turned off. And this goes a long way to mitigating the blast radius when something fails. And as we're talking today about testing in production, this is a huge use case to be able to limit a bad feature if it's not operating correctly. You can just kill it and correct the issue immediately. And the last major use case that we see for feature flags is that of customer access. And this is really kind of a series of use cases that fit into this bucket that are pretty cutting edge. It involves using other internal teams inside your organization, outside of dev, outside of engineering, to help support the turning of features off and on for particular clients. And if you've got clients that are maybe VIP clients, you can turn on particular features for them. Or perhaps you have clients that want to opt into a beta test. You can have your marketing team or your product team or even your sales team empower those clients with particular features. So those are really the major use cases for feature flags, and the benefits that we see. They're vast. It's really effective when tied to your CD pipelines. It gives you flexibility in your business to determine the release dates and let customer facing teams decide when a feature gets released and to whom and when. It also allows new features to get pushed out faster. You can iterate rapidly without any negative consequences. No longer do you have to wait, for monthly release cycles to come around to push a bundle of completed features at one time. You can push features to production at any time, and whether it's fully functional or just beginning to work and just beginning to test it. You can also test multiple solutions and implementations simultaneously to determine the best approach and get that necessary feedback live in production from maybe a just small cohort. And maybe it's just your QA team. You can easily release features into production even daily. And that's something that we're doing here at Harness. We dog food, we use our own platform, and we are pushing to production 100 times or so a day. And we do that by leveraging feature flags. And again, another benefit is you never have to roll back a good feature due to a bad one not working. So if something goes wrong, you can kill it immediately, turn it off, and no deployment rollback is required at all. And these benefits lead to some really positive outcomes. Recently, there was a great survey done and with folks that are using feature flags, engineers who are leveraging in their system, and they reported that they are much happier, that there's faster innovation, that the end users are happier because they're getting the features that they want, that it's being customized for them, that there's better alignment with business. And this is one that I absolutely love, that 75% of feature flag users report a reduction in stress when deploying new code. So if you're not going to, adopt feature flags for your organization, do it for your own health, because engineers are reporting that it's a big deal, reduces stress. So let's talk about this really quick. So now that we kind of know what feature flags are, some of the use cases, we want to switch gears slightly and talk about testing in production. Back in the early 2000s, there was a really great joke that was kind of floating around. I remember seeing the t-shirts. Some of the developers I was working with at the time wore these t-shirts that said, "I don't always test my code, but when I do it in production." And we all laughed about that. We thought, that's pretty funny. That's rogue and how cavalier of you to test your features in production. But this joke has actually now become a reality. If you're sitting in the audience today and you've used feature flags, you know that this is the reality now. It's pushing to production behind flags is almost a non-event because it's not risky. And so we're going to talk about how you can do that. Take this little edgy joke and make it a reality. Why is testing in production less risky these days with feature flag? Well, for one, let's talk about what it is. To begin with, what it is it enables your QA or your dev team to gain real world insights learning at scale. So what we mean by that is when you take a feature, wrap it in a flag, push it to production, and target yourself, you're actually able to learn something in this true production environment that you otherwise could not. You're learning about real world scenarios. Sometimes it's really hard to create these real world scenarios in a testing environment with mock-up data at a smaller scale. It just kind of doesn't really work and give you the best feedback all the time. So when you're testing in a production environment, that answers some really good questions that you can't get any other way. Questions like, what does the real load do to your latest change? How does it operate? And what do users do that's different than expected? Because sometimes you come up with test scenarios in a test environment that it doesn't really relate to the production environment. You get different results than expected. It also answers questions like, are you seeing a performance change? The one you hoped for, or maybe the one you didn't expect? And how's that working out for you? You can also see how users are reacting to the way you intended them to. It also answers questions around how does your change react under various stress situations. So these are just a few examples of why testing in production is really a good practice to have, because it gives you this real world data that otherwise you would not be able to substitute for. So I want to be really extremely clear here too, that if that's what testing in production is with feature flags, here's what it's not. Testing in production is not about just being cavalier about what you release. It's not, a get out of jail free card. It's not insurance, although you can roll back, bad features if there's bad consequences there. But that's not what it is. It's not just about rolling something out consistently, rinse and repeating, and it's not about being cavalier. It's also not about using live data to make sure that your things work. That's what QA testing is for. That's why it's still necessary. It really is about seeing how it reacts in a real world production environment when done correctly. There's some benefits too for testing in production. It highlights some unexpected problems that you may not otherwise have been able to spot ever in a testing environment. So it will start to bubble up different sort of situations that you didn't foresee. It instantly you can switch off without disruption or redeploy within 25 milliseconds. You can kill any offending feature on every connected device, any browser, any client globally. You can target specific end users or cohorts, including yourself as the tester, or even a group of testers, and get that real world data. So there's incredible benefits to testing in production. We're going to talk then really quickly about how to use feature flags and how that compares to Canary deployments.
Yeah, so let me, if you folks may be familiar with Canary deployments, I first want to define what a Canary deployment is, because ultimately Canary deployments and feature flags may seem like they aim to solve the same problem. But what a Canary deployment is to give us the ability to deploy just to a portion of traffic our new code, okay? And so the diagram there is illustrating it pretty well. The reason it's called Canary is it kind of goes back to that analogy of a canary in a coal mine, right? We want to have an early indicator that there's a problem in a coal mine before it's affecting all of our miners, right? And so with a Canary deployment, we can actually deploy maybe 1 or 2 instances of the new version that's going to be running side by side with the old version of our application. Okay, and then just a portion of traffic, a fraction of traffic, is driven to that new version. And it's important to note that this is specific to the amount of traffic, not necessarily the individuals that are using the application. So you can't say maybe a certain subset of users. It's more just a certain percentage of traffic. And really, Canary deployments are a great technique for identifying if this new version of our code that we're deploying even works, right? Does it start up? Does it have connection errors, or does it have performance issues? It's the types of things that we'd want to identify before we drive 100% of the traffic to that new version. Okay. Go on to the next slide there, Andy. So now you may be asking yourself, well, when should I use feature flags versus when should I use Canary deployments? And really, Canary deployments, I believe, are best for testing out new features of your code. And so what you're going to do is you're going to deploy your new code artifact, but have all of the features turned off, right? So we now have our code deployed, and yet we have not released a feature. And it's really about separating the release of a feature and the release of code, right? So when we talk about Canary deployments, that's about deploying the new code artifact, making sure that artifact is working, it's accepting traffic, the error rate's low. If there's a problem with it, we can roll it back before it causes a big problem. Where feature flags is about releasing the feature after a deployment of code, right? First deploy the code, then release the feature. Other things you can do with feature flags, we've already talked a little bit about, is turning on a feature just for a specific subset of your users in a very controlled way, and also being able to test in production, beta testing, having those kill switches and things like that. Okay. And really the goal here is that with a feature flag, we can turn on and off a feature, or roll out a feature, roll back a feature, without having to redeploy our code, right? Like I said earlier, we're separating the deployment of code from the release of a feature.
Hey,
So
Connor,
I guess
real quick,
to quickly answer the question, like
when you're
which
talking,
one should I use? The answer is you should use both because they're for different purposes.
cool. Hey, Connor, real quick,
Mm-hmm.
when you talk about subset of users, how can you what type of target groups can you actually do with feature flags? Can you talk about that a little bit? How do you define subset of users, and what are the parameters
Certainly.
there?
Yeah, so a good example would be maybe you want to test out a feature with, maybe an example of doing testing in production. I just want to turn on the feature for my QA team. I want to turn on that feature in production for just a subset of users that are my internal testers, right? So that'd be a great example of that. Features still turned off for my normal customers, but they're on for my testers and my QA team. Another good example of targeting a feature would be to target maybe your VIP or your beta customers, right? You have a subset of customers that you'd want to release a feature to early before it goes out to everyone, and that'd be a great example for how to target just to a subset of users.
Gotcha. Another quick question that came in here too from the group is talk about a little bit of blue-green deployments. How does that feature work into feature flags?
Yeah, great question. So Canary and blue-green are really there to solve the same purpose. We want to be able to roll back very quickly and have the ability to not have to like redeploy an old version to be able to resolve a problem. So I guess in that example, a blue-green deployment and a Canary deployment would satisfy the same use case around releasing new code and making sure that new code is working. And still, feature flags would be its own way of releasing a feature.
Good,
Great question.
excellent,
Thank you.
perfect. Hey, by the way, keep the questions coming in the chat box there. We're happy to answer those as we go along here. We're going to end up with this third point here about feature flags, and then we're going to move into a demo in a moment here. But feature flags really speed up your software development and can radically change kind of your speed and your velocity there. A few years ago, I climbed Mount Rainier up in Washington, and I was taught while I was climbing this mountain that the quickest and the easiest way to climb a vertical mountain is not obviously running up it. Who would do that? But with something called a rest step. And it involves taking one step and then kind of breathing and resting for a second. And maybe that's just the high altitude, but then you take another step and you rest, and then you take another step and you rest. And the result is you're constantly moving, and you actually end up going up the mountain much faster at a consistent pace because you're not blowing out all your energy at one time. It's the old rabbit and the turtle example, right? And the same is really true with feature flags. We see that the velocity comes when you're able to decouple the deploy from the release. And it means that I can ship consistently dozens of times, even daily, and release when I'm ready, or even better, turn the release over to another team, as we talked about a moment ago, to continue that code release, and so that I can get back and produce more code and get back to development there. So that's really the true definition that we have for progressive delivery, really the tip of the spear of these, using feature flags to move quickly with a lot of velocity. And these smaller steps lead to that higher velocity too. So back to the mountain analogy, there is, if I have a misstep, I can course correct really, really quickly. I can kill off that feature that is offending, rework it, and not have to do a complete rollback. And it creates a much faster, smaller movement there. It's about aiming well and shooting once. I only have to roll back the features that don't work. So I had a client not too long ago. The development team was based in North America. They created a feature, they rolled it out, and went to bed. The Australian support team woke up to a lot of noise on their Twitter feed and support tickets coming in and emails about clients having a bad experience about a feature not working. They were able to, within minutes, locate through an audit log what the offending piece of feature was, is a piece of code, turn it off with a feature flag, and control that blast radius. So they only had to kill one feature. And it's always easier to fix code that you originally made. And so the Australian team went to bed, American team woke up, looked at the code, and was able to fix it. And that is a great example of how you only kill the offending feature that is causing the issue. It creates a lot of velocity too. Feature flags when you ship only when you're ready. So with the rise of continuous delivery, continuous deployment, deployment teams now can ship this new code to production all the time. And feature flags provide this control to developers to only release them when they're ready. And teams can push these codes directly to multiple users in minutes. It's very, very fast. It also eliminates this, as we talked about just earlier, this all or nothing approach, meaning either all customers get the new feature or none at all. So feature flags allow you to roll out that new feature to a small percentage of users at a time, and you can collect that valuable data and iterate slowly over time with a consistent pace. And finally, just to close this off here, faster feedback loops. Again, quickly release these iterations to your market so that you can get this feedback, improve, rewrite, redeploy, and get that velocity that you need. So kind of conclusion here before we jump into this the live demo here, that testing and production has really gone, as we discussed, from this joke to a reality with the spread of modern CD and feature flags. And it's really specifically helped increase this velocity, the responsiveness, while lowering the risk and the cost. And this is critical because the best tests to learn from really are the ones that are in reality, where you can test in production and see what that real world experience looks like. While it can be, if you're not testing in production right now with feature flags, it can be difficult to take that initial leap to test in production. But once you guys get a hang of it and start to see that in production, it's a piece of cake to iterate, reiterate, and expand as your team gets more comfortable with it. So routinely right now, we are seeing companies all over the world that are leveraging feature flags to increase their velocity in code production. And even at Harness, we dog food and use our own tools. And it has allowed us to move extremely quick. When coupled with your CD pipeline, it's the number one thing that increases and contributes to your velocity. So with that, Connor, I'm going to hand the controls over to you. Connor's going to walk us through how to set up flags, how do we target environments, how do we target end users, and kind of take this concept that we're talking about, testing in production, into reality.
Certainly. Thank you, Andy. I will steal your screen shortly. And actually, there's a question that came in around how do we avoid toggle hell? And I think really the question really is about how do we remove flags from our code base when they're done, stale flags and things like that. So maybe after I do a demo here, we'll just make sure we answer that once we get in. I am going to be doing a demonstration of Harness feature flags. So Harness is a software delivery platform that has multiple modules, deployments, builds, cloud cost management, change intelligence, but I'm just focusing on feature flags here today. Okay? And really, there's two parts to getting started with feature flags. The first part is going to be to actually create your first flag. Right, so I'll go ahead and show a list of flags here. These are flags that we've implemented in an app. Things like testing out new UI features, right? Like enabling dark mode, maybe enabling different modules that are maybe in development or partially in development. Okay, and if I look at an individual flag, we can see that there's two different values that flag can be, right? True or false. And you can kind of think of the true value, false value, like show the page or hide the page, enable the feature, disable the feature, right? Another type of flag is called a multivariate flag. And so here's an example here where with this trial limit flag, we're actually able to have multiple different iterations or variations of a feature. It's not just on or off, but rather we have the ability to change the behavior of our application just by changing the value of this flag. So we can have different number of days that we want to expose this trial limit for. And that is a great way to not just release a feature, but also to test out different iterations of a behavior of our application. Okay. So that's the first part of getting started with feature flags, is to create your first flag. The second part is to actually implement the code for an SDK into your application. And so typically flags would be implemented by either client-side SDKs or server-side SDKs. I'll just pick JavaScript SDK here just so you can get an idea of it. You pull in the actual code for the SDK and initialize it. And I'll look at this block right here where we're actually initializing and defining, hey, this is how we want to identify this application that's running in our application. And then identify information about the actual user that's using your application. So the identifier that you would identify that by could be user ID, could be email address, could be company name, things like that, as well as any additional attributes that you might want to segment your features based on. And then lastly, you'd actually, to change the behavior of your application based on the value of a flag, you'd fetch the variation. So in this case, we're testing for the value of our dark theme flag and getting the value back. So now this variable value would be either a true or a false. And then you can code your application to change the behavior based on the value. Okay. Now, there's a couple other things in here as far as updates and making sure that it's always going to be an up-to-date value based on if we're making changes to it. But this is basically the first way to get started. Okay. So then once you have the feature flag created and you have your code implemented, to actually enable a feature is as easy as toggling this toggle, right? To actually turn on and off the feature. And then you're definitely going to want to have other custom rules to be able to segment traffic or segment features, not just for everyone, right? This toggle up here is to enable it globally, but we should also have the ability to maybe roll it out to an individual user, right? Or an individual group of users here. So what we're showing here now is that even when this flag is on, globally we're serving false, so we're not enabling the dark mode feature. However, for a certain subset of users, in this case 17, we are actually enabling this feature, right? And then down here is where we can illustrate that you can also do a percentage rollout. So I want to have only 10% of my users, in this case my beta customers, to get the feature. Okay, so very flexible in the way that you can define a feature rollout, right? Just kind of going back to the old way of doing it, where we're just putting new code on a server, and everyone who hits that server is getting the new feature. We now have a much more granular way of rolling out features to individual users, groups of users, in a percentage rollout way or in a global way. Okay. I will pause here. Andy, any questions that have been coming in that we should answer while I'm going through?
Yeah, a great question is, are there any feature or situations that's not suitable for using feature flags? This is a great question.
Yeah, well, I'll answer the inverse of that. What are the features that are suitable? And it's typically going to be visual changes or behavior changes of an application. So I guess what that would exclude is maybe infrastructure differences, or maybe just like main configuration of your app would maybe not be an appropriate thing to use feature flags for. But other than that, if it's an experience that your user would have in either a visual or behavioral way, that would be appropriate for a feature flag. Want to add anything to that, Andy?
Yeah, I think that's really well said. The exciting time that we're in with feature flags right now is that sky's the limit. You know, I shared 4 big buckets of use cases earlier, but we're seeing more and more all the time. I'm seeing a lot of creativity with feature flags. I was talking to a director of engineering recently where he instructs his dev team to put any new feature behind a flag, just regardless, just put it in standard because you may need it later and you may not. A good rule of thumb, there was another kind of question in here. Maybe how do you deal with feature flag hell? Did I say that right? The question.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's really 2 types of feature flags. You know, you've got short-lived and that are temporary in nature, and then you've got some long-lived permanent ones. And so the ones that are temporary in nature tend to be those features that you've tested, you've rolled out slowly, maybe through a percentage type rollout. You've done targeted cohorts, and then you're ready for that feature to be in GA. And at that point, then I would say that it's time to retire the flag at that point. feature flags are not the number one cause of technical debt, but I'm sure they're up there. And so we want to make sure that we're removing feature flags that are temporary in nature. However, there are some that are permanent. I'm thinking of flags that may have to do with permanent features in your application, like maybe levels of different services. So you've got a gold standard client or a professional levels client or something like that you want to roll out particular features for and turn those off and on. So I hope that kind of answers your question. It is a general best practice to retire those feature flags and remove them. But occasionally you may have some long-lived ones that you want to keep in there for the long term.
Great, thank you. I'm going to reshare my screen and we'll get started with continue on with the demo. And actually, while I do that, I'm going to answer another question that came in, which is, will the production feature flag result in replacement of testing in a QA environment? I think really what we're getting at here is, are we making changes, like when we release a feature, how can we control enabling or disabling a feature at an environment level? And just to kind of show, when I'm looking at this dark mode flag that we were showing earlier, in the top right, you see I actually am making all of these changes to this flag in a demo environment. Meanwhile, our production environment has a completely different configuration. So this would be how you could enable, maybe roll out a feature just to your development environment, right? But not necessarily yet roll it out to your production environment. And ultimately, maybe if I step over here and show a pipeline, the harness also provides this ability of kind of defining the how we enable features across different environments. And that's going to probably include, maybe some change management integrations, like with Jira or something like that. So all the approvals for going on to the next stage of a deployment. First, we roll it out to our beta users, then we're going to do approval with Jira, and then we're going to roll it out to a percentage of our production users, things like that. All of these can be defined in the course of a pipeline. So it can be a very repeatable process for how we release features. Okay. Maybe I want to show kind of a real-time example of a feature flag. I'm going to pull up this application here. Everyone, if you can please pull out your phone and go ahead and scan this QR code. It's going to bring you to a website that has a little yellow birdie on it. That is the harness mascot, which is Canary. I'll leave this up for just another minute. Maybe I'll make some room so we can see everything. All right, so this application that we built here has a few different feature flags that we have hidden different visual parts of the application behind. Okay, so in this case, we have fashion for our different Captain Canary. By the way, if anyone hasn't scanned the QR code, I'm going to pull it off in about 2 seconds here. But we have different ways of having fashion for our Captain Canary, and we have different ways of modifying the behavior of the actual background of the application. Okay? So I'll scroll up here so we can all watch. If you didn't get a chance to scan the QR code, you can just watch my screen here. There we go. All right, so right now our Captain Canary is apparently wearing nothing, but we can instead update this to have him wearing a bow tie. All right, or maybe we tested out that feature and we didn't really like it. We want to instead have him try on some sunglasses. Right? Hopefully what this is illustrating is kind of the ability to change the behavior of your application in real time. A couple things to note: for all these changes that I've made, we do not have to redeploy our code. We do not have to restart our servers, right? It's all done kind of in runtime of our application. Other variation we have here is the ability to change like background, things like that. So hopefully what this is illustrated is some of the use cases that you can use for feature flags and how your life can be different, right? Reduce the stress of releasing software. Release the software when at your leisure with the flag turned off, and then when we're ready to release a feature, we can enable the flag to do so.
Gotcha, Connor. We've got a question coming in here. This is UI. The UI that's being shown here is harness. So the question is, how does it interact with the actual code? What's going on in the background to make this connection that we're seeing?
Yeah, certainly. So I showed that that example of, for instance, a JavaScript SDK or server-side SDK. That SDK, which is implemented in your application code, on startup of the app or when someone browses to the site, it's actually going to query to the Harness API that is ultimately returning evaluation value, like what the evaluation of a flag is. So it's a SaaS solution that is being used to update the behavior of your app by using that SDK and connecting directly to it. Just so if anyone's curious, we also have the ability to have a local cache or a local proxy. So if for availability and reliability purposes, that's available as well.
Good. Another question that came in. I'll grab this one. Will the production or testing of feature flags in production replace QA testing environments? So I think the question there is, should we just fire our QA teams and say, away with it? Let's just all test in production. And that is an emphatic no. This is not a complete substitute for QA testing and careful, thoughtful testing environments that we set up prior to going to production. It is a way to speed that up, but testing in production is giving you real world data, as we discussed, that you cannot oftentimes duplicate within a testing environment. So not a substitute by any measure, but a great opportunity to get some data points. Perfect.
Let me ask the next question I'm seeing come in here. So the question is maybe a concern around the performance of the SDK. I think that a good way to think about this. So first off, all the evaluations and the rules for how flags should be evaluated are actually cached locally in your application, and the actual evaluations are done locally or maintained locally. It's just the rule set that the SDK is downloading. And so that means every time that we do an evaluation of a flag, we're not making another API call to do that. It's just immediately responded. And if you think about it, you can kind of compare this to, so a lot of customers that are adopting a feature flag solution might already be using things like a database toggle, right? Where they look up a field in a database, or maybe they look up a value in a configuration file. It would be equivalent response time or performance hit as those solutions. And then the second part of Eugene's question, if not, are we going to leave the broken code in production till the next deploy? I think I understand the question. So let's say we found a bug in our code and we have turned off a flag to disable the feature. And the question is, well, how the code is clearly broken, even though the flag is turned off. So yes, I guess from a development practice, the best next step is to fix that bug, redeploy it. But the benefit now is you don't have to wait to hotfix that bug and get it deployed for the feature or the bug to be taken away in production. We can turn off the feature, get us back to functioning in production while we kind of can take our time to fix the bug at our own leisure instead of having to be in a crazy P1 outage or something like that.
Yeah. Got a question here, Connor. Why should I trust a third-party solution to change the behavior of my application? I love this question. The number one solution out on the marketplace, if you're not using Harness, the number one solution out on the marketplace is homegrown. That is the one that we come up against the most with clients contacting us saying, well, listen, we got a homegrown solution. We want to look at Harness. My first question is, why are you looking at Harness then if the homegrown solution is that you've already got one? And invariably they say, because it doesn't scale. It's not workable. So why should you trust a third-party solution? We have spent a lot of time building in a lot of RBAC into it, a lot of global governance. It is usable by other teams in your organization outside of developers. And I can't say 100% of the time, but gosh, it's got to be north of 95% of the time. Homegrown solutions normally lack all of those features. They lack a UI. They oftentimes have to be restart. You got to restart the application for the changes to take effect. There is no RBAC. There is no governance. There's no approvals. There's no scheduling of flags. There's none of these deep features that we have built in. And there are some other tools out there that have that as well. And so a third-party solution is a great step. And I'll ask you this. Another question just came in that kind of goes along with this, and that is, what happens if harness is down? Great question. How does it impact my application?
I can answer that. So first off, in our SDK, and actually maybe I'll reshare my screen just so I can illustrate this a little bit. Two ways that we're going to help with that. So first off, we have this ability to deploy with this relay proxy. So here's each of instances of your application that have our SDK in it. And instead of these SDKs connecting all the way back to Harness's SaaS environment to fetch the logic, which is going to be the default option, another option is to deploy a relay proxy. And this relay proxy is going to keep a local cache of all the evaluation rules. So if for whatever reason there would be maybe a temporary disconnect of being able to connect back to Harness's APIs, that relay proxy is actually going to be serving the rules. And even up to including it'll have a persistent connection to like a Redis database, so that it can have when it restarts, it'll have a warm cache as well. So that's option number one. And then really the second part is going to be the ability to define a default value. So if let's say there was a configuration problem, the flag doesn't even exist, or there's a terrible connection issue, anytime we fetch a variation or we're trying to evaluate a variation like this dark theme variation, the second parameter there is the default. So if all else fails and we cannot identify what the value is, this is the value it'll come back from. So what that means is at no point in time would we actually affect your app wouldn't load or wouldn't be functional, because we'd have those safeguards in place.
Thinking along those lines, Connor, what if you have a ton of virtual machines or applications spun up and a lot? I'm thinking kind of an outlier case here. How do you then manage that traffic back and forth between Harness and server, calling all the time and constantly, checking on the status of flags? What kind of solutions are in place out in the market right now?
Yeah, certainly. So I showed example of, so far I've been showing our client side SDK, which is on the JavaScript side running in browser, right? We also have server side SDKs for your .NET, your Java, your Go, your PHP applications, things like that. And those SDKs are actually going to, when they start up, are going to download a full set of the logic, or the rule set for the flags. They're actually going to do those evaluations locally. And then they're going to listen for updates. So as I'm toggling a toggle in our UI, the instances of the SDK are going to get an event that the rule set has changed and re-download that rule set. So what that means is it's not a chatty connection. It's actually only transferring changes ultimately, and also that means all the evaluations are done locally as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, and actually there was another question that Eugene was asking about, like, is this just for front end changes and not for back end? Certainly not. You can use this. The two examples I showed were very specific to like UI front end experience changes. But the other use case is really just around behavior of the application. And that could be a front end app or a back end app. Could be your API. This would be a good way, hey, if you want to test out different behavior of how your API should function, or different versions of back-end implementation of API, that would be a great use case for feature flags as well.
Perfect. Well, I think that is all the questions that have come in. Just looking here, if another one pops in the next couple of moments, we can handle that. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate the time that we were able to spend with you today. We apologize for the latency that we had on the connection earlier. Always seems to happen at the wrong moment, but thanks for your patience on that. One thing we want to direct you to is, if you are wanting to try out feature flags for free, then you can go over to Harness canary.io. You can download feature flags on your own. You can even download our CD solution and start to set those up and start to try that out. In fact, Connor, this brings up a question that maybe we should answer, and that is, how easy is it to start with feature flags? Like, what are if somebody on the line today is new to that, what would you suggest? How do they get started?
Well, I would suggest, first off, it's very easy to implement the actual SDK, right? Like create a flag and implement it. We're basically, at the end of the day, giving you a Boolean true false value, right? Dynamically. So my recommendation for what should my very first feature flag be? It should be whatever feature you're building right now, right? Maybe you're adding a new component to an application. Maybe you're modifying how the UI looks. Maybe you're changing the behavior of a backend API. Go ahead and wrap that new logic or that change logic in if in an if block or an if else block, using the value of a feature flag. That'll allow you to deploy that code right away, right? Potentially even before it's tested, because we can leave it off, and then you can test it for just yourself in production on a production data set. So yeah, there's really nothing to prevent you. I would say recommend to just get started on whatever feature you're developing today would be a great way to get started.
Excellent. I've got another question that came in here. Can you please elaborate a bit more on the feature flag hell, especially on testing in pre-production? I came from a background where the testing against all different variations, combinations, which is pretty challenging. So I'd like to know more about how things change to make that better, especially if there are tons of features we are publishing daily. What do you think, Connor? How do we handle that feature flag hell in pre-production?
Yeah, well, I think I think the first definition of feature flag hell is like we just have too many feature flags.
Yeah.
And then this one you're suggesting here, Eugene, is really around we have too many variations of a flag, right? Like we've exhausted all the different permutations of how our application could potentially work. If we have lots of flags and lots of variations, it could be difficult to do that. And I think it really comes down to a testing strategy around like what the release cadence is, right? And how many different iterations are even likely to be existing at any one time, right? And then or what the plan is for how to release a feature. It's going to be very dependent on that. But ultimately, what we see, the customers that are getting the most value out of feature flags do not have a lengthy, complicated testing, verification, QA, not like non-prod process. We are releasing features very quickly, like reducing the amount of time from the developer committing to when it makes it to production. And then QA can be a shorter process because it's not as risky when a bug gets to production, right? I think that's an important concept to consider. You don't have to go through weeks and weeks and weeks of testing of a release because we have the ability to roll it back in 2 seconds if there's a problem. So it's really kind of changing the mindset of how verification of an application works.
Gotcha. So one last question. Is feature flags a substitute for a CD rollback? How do they differ in your mind, Connor?
CD rollback is going to be most valuable, or really the only option for if the new artifact we're deploying is non-functional, right? If it's can't connect to the database, or there's an actual like flaw in the app where it can't even start up, you have to do a rollback in that case. Rollbacks take time. Rollbacks, especially if there's like database migrations that need to run, like sometimes it's actually very difficult and a lengthy process to do a rollback, in which case that's really where feature flags comes in buying us time to turn off that bug while we work through doing the rollback.
Good. That makes a lot of sense. Appreciate that. Last question. How are feature flags defined around dependencies? Like, for example, if I have a feature A that's dependent on feature B, should that be defined as a single flag where both A and B works? We get this question a lot. So I'll tell you just a quick example really quick, Connor. I was talking with a client not too long ago. He was actually working. He had his homegrown system, and he admitted to me that he had over 600 flags in his system. And he said it in really quiet, hushed tones because he wasn't proud of it. But he said, I have over 600 flags. I don't know how to retire them because I think there's dependencies in there. If I flip one, is it going to affect 15 or 20 others? So he's kind of at a stalemate, a little unsure as to how to clean up those flags. So how do we handle dependencies? What's a best practice on that?
Yeah, well, I didn't show it specifically in the demo, but Harness has a capability of defining a prerequisite for a flag. And really what that means is before I can turn on this feature, this other feature also has to be on. So if there is these dependencies that you're talking about where, A and B have to go together, or you can't turn on A unless B is already on, you can define those at the flag level. And that'd be a good way to, let's say maybe there's an overarching feature for a module, and then within that module, there's multiple different features. That'd be a great use case of using prerequisites. And if you want to look into that further, I'd encourage you to take a look at a trial of the Harness feature flag solution.
Great. Thanks for that. Well, Cody, back to you. And as our parting shot here, follow us on Twitter. Look us up on LinkedIn. We are more than happy to help you get started along the way. We have a lot of documentation on our website. You can download it for free, and you can also hit us up, and we'll help you out. Thanks a lot.
Outstanding. Thank you, Connor and Andy, for being with us today, for providing an in-depth and live demo that I was even able to follow along with. So I really appreciate you guys coming on here and bringing your expertise with you. Quick reminder for our audience today that our session was recorded. Following the conclusion of this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access that on-demand recording. Or you can also find it living on the DevOps website. Just visit devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section. Now to announce the 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing. Our first winner is Reed H. Our second winner is Irene H. Our third winner is Gaurav B. And our fourth winner is Chandu P. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't see that email, keep an eye on your spam folder as well. I'd like to thank Andy and Connor for being here with us today. I'd like to thank Harness for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks goes to you, our audience, for being here with us for today's program. Have a great rest of your day. Please fill out our post-webinar survey. We hope to see you at a future TechStrong webinar.